project, which was in conjunction with Alan Wilton and then also with Kylie Cairns as well. But I think I might kick off first of all talking about why we're concerned about dingo conservation. Why is it of importance to us? And so just to touch on a little bit from an Aboriginal perspective, that dingoes, as Kylie mentioned, have been here for certainly many thousands of years. They've been adopted into Aboriginal religious beliefs and are a cultural animal. So there are a lot of people, even within New South Wales, but certainly through the central desert country, their totem is dingo. They're a spiritual protector as well. So dingo, especially in the Western Desert Block, which is about a third of Australia as a cultural block, right through Central Australia, the Western Desert Block, having dingoes as part of your camp were also a spiritual protector. So mamu, devil spirits that might affect you and your family, dingoes would be part of a warning system and a protection system against evil spirits. So important from that perspective. A companion animal, so we've all heard about like a one dog night, a 2 dog night, about having dogs that when you're really cold, especially out in that desert country, having a number of dogs that you can snuggle up against, and shared warmth obviously are very important as a companion animal, and obviously important in terms of that personal perspective as well, in terms of the bond that people create with their pets. They assisted in game hunting. Dingoes are particularly good hunters. People talk about a really good roo dog, a really good roo dingo in terms of being able to assist in pulling down. When you look at a lot of the wildlife in Central Australia now, has gone as a result of a whole variety of changes that have occurred in Australia. But there are lots of species, bettongs and others, that used to live just within the grass communities. They didn't burrow underground, they were actually above ground. To be able to move through those areas and then flush those animals, dingoes, having them on your side, very quickly can then catch those animals and then make them available to you as part of your hunting. And clearly they were a food source as well. So if times got really hard and you were looking for food items and you couldn't, and you were starting to starve, your dingo could provide that source of food. So here's just a picture. This is Mick Jabaljari. He's a Papunya man, but just showing how dingo and dingo tukapa, dingo dreaming, has been incorporated into his belief system, and now he recreates that within his art form. But you can actually look at the landscape. If you go to Cooperpedy, and you look out through Cooperpedy at the breakaways, and you've got this location here where you've got a white and then sort of a yellow-orange hill. That's dingo tukapa, that's dingo dreaming in those areas. So it's a white dingo and a yellow dingo, and there's all stories associated with that. If you go to Uluru, which is a place that I worked for many years, dingo dreaming, dingo tukapa is a really strong part of the stories around Uluru. Kurapangu, which is a devil dingo, came in from Docker River, from the Western Country, through into Uluru in the dreaming time. The Mala men, which is the rufous hair wallaby, which is the Mala up in the top left of the screen. The Mala men were having a ceremony at Uluru, and the Windolka men, which are Acacia men at Docker River, they invited them to come and join their ceremony. Excuse me. To join their ceremony. Mala men said, no, sorry, but we're busy with our own. The Windolka men took offence from that, and they conjured up Kurapangu. Kurapangu is a devil dingo, and sent it out to seek revenge on the Mala men. And it came through to Uluru, it hunted the Mala men down, and it slaughtered them. And then a few of them got away, and they headed to the south. This is just a picture of the desert country, and with Uluru to the centre and then down into South Australia. And Kurapangu actually hunted the Mala men down, and he'd find them and slaughter them. And he went further and further south, all the way to Ulkia, which is many, many hundreds of kilometres to the south. And there's lots of dreaming and stories associated with that slaughtering and that interaction between Mala and Kurapangu along those trails. But it's not only within Central Australia, it's also here. There's dingo dreaming that occurs up through the Northern Rivers area that's been well documented. Out at Karamba, there's stories for dingo through there. So very much important from a cultural perspective. But from a non-Aboriginal perspective, that conservation and that cultural importance, they're a native species to us. And within our legislation, in Queensland, they're recognised as a native species. Other territories, they're in that legislation as native. But they're an iconic species. There's no question about that. We're all here because they're really interesting and of value to us. They're a top order predator, and they suppress invasive pest species, pigs and goats in particular. And there's other speakers that are going to talk today about that function of them as a top order predator, and I hope you'll stick around to hear those. What I want to talk about, and elaborate a little bit further, Kylie touched on this, about what are the threats, why dingoes need conserving, why are they slipping away, especially in terms of New South Wales. Loss of habitat was one of those. There's the three, but loss of habitat first. So we've changed the landscape, our cities, we've moved into agriculture. Agriculture, those changes also changed the prey species that dingoes rely upon. The macropods, the possums, the hollows that provided shelter for those species that dingoes used to prey on. A lot of those have declined, and as a result, dingo numbers have declined. The map to the right-hand side, you would have seen it in Kylie's. This is showing you where those densities are. And you can see within New South Wales, we only extend really down the east coast, where dingoes are still remaining, and in Sturt National Park, right out in the very corner, out of Three Ways. The other, though, which is even more important, is their declaration as a pest animal. And that's the hardest thing to manage in terms of dingoes within New South Wales. The distribution, so we just did a bit jump. The distribution of dingoes and wild dogs right across Australia, that's the shaded area, so they're really quite extensive. We saw the previous match, there are abundance of areas across there. And then, of course, we've got the dingo barrier fence, 5,500 kilometres, that was built to try and protect livestock operations from the impacts of dingoes way back in the last 200 years. So we've got that fence. It still exists today. It's still maintained in varying degrees, and it's very effective in those areas where it's maintained, elsewhere less so. So let's have a look at that legislation, because Amagi was quite keen just to give you a picture in terms of where do they sit in the law, dingoes. So I wanted to go first to Queensland and just give you a bit of an idea there, because it's confusing and it's complicated. But in Queensland, they're both protected as an animal, but they're also declared as a pest animal. And so, and I've got the legislation that's there. I don't know whether you want to get into the detail, but the Nature Conservation Act, the dingo is a part of native wildlife in Queensland, but also under the Biosecurity Act, the landholders have a legal responsibility to control wild dogs. Wild dogs are dingoes, and we'll talk more about the distinction between the two. But in Queensland, a wild dog is a dingo hybrid, and a feral dog that's gone wild. If you come to Victoria, so let's look at our neighbours down to the south. We've got this scenario where they're also protected, but then they're also declared as a pest animal. So, but interestingly in Victoria, and the first dot point that's there is that the dingo has been listed as threatened under their Flora and Fauna Act. So that's certainly much more progressed than say for Queensland. The dingo is also protected on public lands under the Wildlife Act, so that's the national parks areas. But dingoes are also unprotected on public lands within 3 kilometres of any private property within the areas that are hatched. If we go to that picture that I showed you in terms of abundance, and you look at where dingoes are within Victoria, and then you look at the hatched areas, so anywhere within hatched areas is where dingoes still persist within Victoria. Any national park that has a border with a private landholder, they have an obligation to control dingoes 3 kilometres in from that border, from those private lands. So as you know, most national parks and forestry lands as well, they're not really that large. Apart from places like Kosciuszko and the alpine areas, you go 3 kilometres in from a boundary and there's no land left in terms of where dingoes can be managed in terms of conserving and preserving them. So let's come home to New South Wales. So what are we looking at here? Here it's a little bit more straightforward in some respects. They're declared a pest animal. Dingoes here are wild dogs. So whenever, in terms of from a legislative point of view, or you're talking to land managers within government, and they say we're dealing with wild dogs, they mean we're dealing with dingoes, dingo hybrids, and feral dogs that have gone wild, the three together. And they're all wild dogs in terms of the legislation. We've got a Biosecurity Act that's been put in place where there's now, this has only just now come into effect last year in 2017. The Act was enacted in 2015, where there's a general biosecurity duty where wild dog risk is prevented, eliminated or minimised. So that's your responsibility as a landholder. And then in addition to that, there's a thing called a pest control order. This is under the Local Land Services Act. And that pest control order requires all of us as landholders to eradicate wild dogs, so that includes dingoes, on our lands and report any wild dog to the Local Land Services. So it's pretty straightforward then from a legislative point of view that any dingo that is on private land in New South Wales is a declared pest and needs to be controlled. That's how the law sits. And I think that hasn't been clear to a lot of people for a long time. One exception is when you come to areas called Schedule 2 lands. So it gets a little bit complicated, so try and stay with me. Schedule 2 lands, there's 113 national parks and 139 state forests that have been identified as Schedule 2 lands where there are two objectives, not only to control wild dogs and eradicate them, but also to conserve dingoes, and those two sit together. So that's quite a large area. That management and that protection, in terms of managing dingoes, is encapsulated within a wild dog management plan that's developed with government agencies and with the neighbouring landholders. And that plan is to look at those two objectives together. Very challenging, very difficult to be able to reach that. And so in terms of managing dingo populations within New South Wales, what you're looking at is trying to find that balance between the two. One is to conserve dingoes within the Schedule 2 lands, and then the other then is to control dingoes to the extent necessary to protect livestock producers, because they need to earn their living and they need a capacity to be able to produce produce that we require to survive. And trying to get that balance right is a real challenge in New South Wales. And I don't think we're getting it right at the moment. There's a lot of room to improve. So that's loss of habitat. That's looking then at declaration as a pest animal. The third threat is looking at that genetic dilution through hybridisation. So what's left within New South Wales in terms of pure dingoes? One thing that's been identified in terms of legislation here is that hybridisation by feral dogs is seen as a threatening process. That threatens the survivability of dingoes. So but that's been acknowledged in legislation, which is really good to see within New South Wales. So if we're going to look at what level of hybridisation is occurring within New South Wales, we need to look at what method we're going to use. And Kylie very kindly has taken you through these, so you now know about skull morphometrics, which is good. You know about morphological characteristics, and you can't. The pictures here at the bottom are actually from trappers who worked in Kosciuszko, and this is some of the different types of colorations that occur within the wild dog and dingo and hybrid populations through Kosciuszko. But we started on a project that looked specifically using the DNA technique, in particular the 3Q microsatellite that Kylie's been talking about. And we started this in 1996, and we've gone right the way through to, we're still collecting samples now, but in particular I want to show you the results for that period, 1996 through to 2012. How do we collect the samples? So initially we embarked on going out into those national parks and forestry lands and setting traps to be able to capture the dingoes. These are leg hold traps that will rubber line so that when the dog put their foot into the trap it would close, but it doesn't break skin. It doesn't do damage to the dingoes or to any other species that are captured. We're very careful from a humane perspective to do this appropriately. The dingoes were then placed down onto a sampling board with a strap that would go around the waist, around the chest, and then one around the neck. And then a cover would be placed over the head. This was a really interesting thing with dingoes, because of when they live within a pack structure and they're working out their hierarchy within that, they're constantly suppressing one another and learning to submit. Oh, you're the boss, okay, I'll sit down and be quiet. So when they went onto the sampling board, as soon as they were restrained and the cover was put on the head, they just go and relax. There was no stress associated with it. Once they're on the sampling board, we microchipped, we took some DNA material for the analysis to take place. And then we'd uncover the dog, we'd release the straps and then lift the board. And the dingo, and you think, well, okay, this is a wild dog, what's it going to do when I release it from the board? Is it going to come back and be aggressive towards me? But every single time, it's just hundreds of times, we'd lift the board and the dingo would drop to the ground and it would just trot off. And it'd get to about here to the tree and then it'd stop and it'd turn and it'd look and go, what's that all about? And then off it would go. Through this sample and plus through this survey technique, and then also working with people who are doing control for wild dogs and dingoes and collecting material from animals that have been hit on the road, we collected a whole lot of DNA material, plus the work from the trapping. In all, 783 samples that we actually had a physical geographical location. Those samples are then those samples were then part of the genetic study using the 3Q method. What 3Q method allows us to do is it breaks it up into broad groups, 1 through 7. The first two, it's a dingo 1 or a dingo 2, and Kylie talked to you about the reference population, so that's saying they're the same genetically through this analysis as those dingoes that you might see at a park within a zoo that are presented as dingoes. So they're the same genetically. We then have this other band, 3, 4 and 5, where they're hybridised, and you can look at the degree of hybridisation from better than 75%, 65 to 75%, and then moving down. And then the last two, which is where genetically they're more dog than dingo, so less than 50% dingo, or then to feral dog. So we break that up normally into 3 broad groups, but there's 7 actual scores. And this is after Alan Wilton, so this is again Alan's technique. So what did we get when we did that analysis for 783 samples? From a broad perspective, we can put it together into a pie chart of those 3 broad categories. 13% of those 783 samples from the Queensland border all the way down to around Newcastle are basically dingoes. 78% are more dingo than dog, and they're hybridised. And 9% are more dog than dingo. The other thing that was really interesting is that if you look at this figure right at the very bottom, when we talk about wild dogs, we're often thinking, well, that's a domestic dog that's gone wild, that's now breeding in the wild. Look at that figure, it's less than 1% of those 783 wild dogs that were captured are actually feral animals, feral domestic dogs that have gone wild. 78% of them are dingoes and dingo hybrids. 13%, 1 in 10, are as pure as anything that you're going to see at a zoo in Australia as a dingo. Now, Kylie showed you the results of the 1995 study by Danielle Stevens, and she talked about, because this is the area where this study has occurred, and why those figures then look different to what I've just presented to you. She talked about one of the reasons for that, and said this is an averaging system, and also whether she's comparing these results to a reference population that's different to the one that we're using. But the other is just the sample size. Within New South Wales, they only had 95 samples, and they did all of that mapping in New South Wales based on 95. The work that I'm reporting to you now is based on 783, and it's all from northeast New South Wales, using the same technique. So what we can do, though, then is use an approach similar to what Danielle used, but slightly different analysis of taking all of those samples and then putting them through analysis to look at where are the hotspots of dingo genetic purity within that samples that have been collected. It's a KDE analysis. I don't think I'll get into the technical aspects of that. If people are interested, we can talk about it later. But we had hotspots that were identified. And you can see where you get these concentrations of colour. Now, I've zoomed into 4 of those to talk about it in a bit more detail. So here, one of those hotspots is around Washpool. So we're looking at an area that's, so we've got Tenterfield, because it's a little bit hard to see, Tenterfield coming down, and this is Washpool National Park, predominantly actually in the northern parts of Washpool, which is when you get into the drier, more sclerophyll forest, rather than that thick rainforest that's also characteristic of Washpool to the south. So this is one area where we've got a hotspot of dingoes of conservation value that are still hanging on, despite all of the threats that they're up against. Another location closer to home in terms of here is the Guy Fawkes Cathedral Rock area in New England. So this is Guy Fawkes, we've got Airborne just here, Cathedral Rock, and then down into the New England area. Not as strong as Washpool and the other sites, but still really significant. And I pulled together some pictures so that, because we keep talking about dingoes, but what does a dingo really look like? Because we've seen them here, but these are all dingoes that are part of breeding programs, aren't they? So in the wild, this is a pure dingo that came out of the New England. Came out of the back of Point Lookout quite some years ago in the early part of the study. So that's what we look at in terms of a pure dingo as an example within that area of the study. This is a dingo, which is a category 4. So 65 to 75% dingo. Pretty hard to pick though, isn't it? Doesn't that still looks very much like the dingoes that we're seeing around here. We're still looking at white toe tips. We've got a white tip on the tail. It's the ginger yellow colour. Really hard to pick where that genetically they're a bit different, but morphologically they still look very similar. In his example, there are many examples.
It's almost looks alpine. Floppy looking alpine.
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
like that look.
yeah. It's got characteristics like that. This is a score 5, so this is still a dingo. This is more dingo than dog, but it's clearly looking quite different. Although you do get black dingo as well. You get white dingo, and you get black and tan, and then you get yellow. So that's an example of 5. We move down to Port Macquarie, another area where there's a hotspot. You go north of Port Macquarie into the Lime Burners Creek Nature Reserve, up towards Hat Head, across to Maria National Park. That's this area through here, another hotspot in terms of where there's some good genetics that are hanging on. So let's have a look. This is an example of a score 2 of a dingo in Lime Burners Creek Nature Reserve. Mifsud was her name. This is another one called Mum. This is you can see the codes of one. This is 2007, so this is from when she was captured and sampled. That's a score 2, so that's a pure dingo based on this genetic study approach. This is a score 4, a particularly good-looking individual, I think. But Nibbler, I think is the name that's there, and that's 65 to 75% he was. Here's another score 4, so quite different. And you can see what's happened here in terms of, you can see the sabling, so the black through the coat and then through the tail. Some believe that that's representative of hybrid genes coming into the dingo population. But those that are working this area, it's not that cut and dry, but that's one of the things, one of the indications that there's some people. The next one they want to talk about is Mile Lakes. We head down further to the south. Really, really interesting area, because Mile Lakes, there's a lake system through here and Nelson's Bay just to the south. Really, really high concentration of animals of conservation value that are occurring there. More detail around that. The yellow dots that are through here is the points where the dingoes were sampled. Collected from this area were 27 dingoes that were trapped, marked. They were radio collared, they had earmarks. It was quite a detailed study in its own right. Jeff James was a person who coordinated most of this on the ground. But I've actually pulled out the specific results because it's really interesting in terms of this genetic assessment. Dingo 1 and 2, 59% of them are basically pure dingoes in the Mile Lakes. 30% are better than 3/4. So roll those two together, 90% of the dingoes, 9 out of 10, are high quality animals within the Mile Lakes area. So the question then is, well, why Mile Lakes? Like, out of all of the places that we've looked at, Washpool, and you come down to the Guy Forks and so on, why are they hanging on there? Potentially it's got to do with the lake system and the lakes working as a geographical barrier. In terms of movement of dog genes and hybrid genes coming in, so potentially they're geographically isolated to some degree. Could be a part of it. There's not a lot of baiting that occurs in this landscape, or at least traditionally, in the forestry lands behind Mile Lakes. So, something to ponder. Interestingly, when you look down, there's no feral dog. There's no dogs that are more dog than dingo. A really interesting sample. And so these are the animals that were part of that sample. So here we've got Hunter. He came out as a pure dingo. Again, you see the white feet, paws, white tail tip. Dark on the muzzle. Those people who have dingoes and have bred them up from pups will notice how they're quite often really dark on the muzzle when they're young. But as they get older, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, often that can actually disappear and then they lighten. So something to keep in mind. This is score 2, another pure dingo, based on this analysis. This is score 5. This is, they named him an old boy, and you can see he's got actually a tracking collar. So he was radio tracked to look at what his movements were through this area. Hard to know what his age is, but a lot of scarring through the face. Like he obviously works really hard to stay alive and stay within his pack. And quite an interesting individual. So that's the results of the genetic study looking at DNA using the 3Q method that Alan Wilton developed. There's another project that I've contributed some samples to, which we started about 3 years ago, which is now just starting to produce results. And I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea of the results that we're getting in relation to this area. This is using SNP genetics that Kylie talked about, and this is where her new area of study is going. And as she mentioned, the 3Q method is gives you results into broad bands, but with the SNP genetics, you can get down to basically 1% of admixture, meaning 1% of dog genes coming into a sample. So, and these are the people who are involved with that project. Kyle Zenger is the geneticist that's working on the program. These are samples that have been collected from a variety of places, from Fraser Island within Queensland, Victoria. But these are the samples that were contributed from our backyard in terms of the areas inland of Maclean. All of those samples have been mapped out, and this is just looking at how genetically they group together. New Guinea singing dog, which sits off to the left. The New South Wales group sits together and they break up. I'm not going to dwell on that. This is of more interest from my perspective in terms of dingo and then the degree of hybridisation. And it's a small degree that's occurring. It's between, for the populations that we're dealing with, around about 13 to 15% of hybridisation within those samples. Here you've got some examples of clearly wild dogs, clearly feral dogs that have gone wild. And these are the New Guinea singing dog. This is the one of most relevance to us though. So this is looking at the results for those samples that were collected in the Upper Macleay. And it's looking inland from, this is Kempsey. Here we've got Port Macquarie to the south, and these are the locations moving up the Macleay River. There's a dirt road that goes from Kempsey all the way through to Armidale, so it's moving up through that valley, through Willawarra, Bellbrook, and so on. And each of these pie charts is showing you, based on SNP genetics, the amount of dingo versus hybrid admixture, where dog genes are starting to come in or being recognised within the population. And it varies from 3 to 13%. And that's just in our backyard. That's really just sliding off the slopes here and going down to the south. So this is a subset. This is 23 of those samples. And again, giving us a good indication in our backyard that there are animals of conservation value that are still out there. But there is hybridisation that's occurring. So the question I posed really at the start up, are there dingoes of conservation left in northeast New South Wales? I think quite clearly there are. And therefore we do need some support and focus on managing them appropriately to try and conserve them. But there's some questions that we do need to consider around that. What level of hybridisation is acceptable? Do they have to be pure? They've got to be 100%? Can they be 95? Can they be 90? I don't have answers to that, but they're the discussions I think people should be having. Can we control hybridisation? Can we actually, talking to Kylie earlier, potentially can it be bred out of them? Can we look at ways of reducing further hybridisation occurring? What steps can we take from a management perspective? And the other is, does hybridisation actually change the ecological role and function that they perform in our landscape? Does it matter? Are we trying to preserve dingoes because we want a pure genetic dingo in our landscape? Or do we want to preserve them for the roles that they perform in terms of their ecological function? And when does that function change? 2 or 3%, 5 or 10%, 30 or 40%? They're the questions that I think people should be looking at, and further people should be looking at from a research perspective. This study ran over a very large number of years, and there's been an enormous number of people who have been involved. Just my thanks to the individuals here. In particular, a whole lot of people within national parks and also local land services, rural lands protection boards. A lot of people have contributed material to this study, and I acknowledge and give thanks to them. Great, thanks, that's it.
Last slide, yeah, this one just before this one, just to prompt on Henry.
This one?
Yeah, so what level of hybridisation is acceptable in wild dingo populations? Can you argue the point that if they're performing the function of a top order predator, then they could be down 65%? You know, if they're out there doing the top order predator job, then that's enough.
It certainly can be argued, and I think part of the development of that argument is looking at when do they biologically change to hybridisation. So when do they go from only breeding once per year?
Yeah.
Do they start to breed potentially twice per year, which is what our domestic dogs and feral dogs can do in the wild? When do they stop forming pack structures where they have alpha males and females, and so you get that control in terms of breeding within the pack that occurs? So they're all questions that I think need to be looked at in more detail, so that managers and people who are working in this space can make informed decisions about, well, at 60% it starts to change. Maybe it's at 10%. We don't know.
Supplementary to that, if you mentioned just at the end there about can we breed it out of them? Is it desirable even to breed it out of them? Breed the dog markers and things out. I'm just interested in your opinion. I had my own, but I'm interested in your opinion on whether dingo genes are so strong that they would breed out within 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations or something and breed themselves back to purity.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I would think, from my perspective, if you have genes that are coming in that what's an example, like fluffy tails on poodles.
Yeah.
What's the advantage of that potentially that might breed out? I remember, like, for a number of years collecting material, I used to engage with professional trappers from Kosciuszko, and they'd come up and assist with the trapping and releasing of the dingoes when we were working in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they used to talk about in Kosciuszko that there's stumpy tail dingo, and a lot of the dingoes that they would capture have a stumpy tail, and so that's the assumption being that that's a degree of hybridisation that had come in. That was part of what their thinking was. But is there a genetic advantage of a stumpy tail? I can't say that there would be. But it seems to be persisting in terms of those Kosciuszko dogs. So I'd throw that to Kylie.
It might not be that it's advantageous, it might just not be bad enough to breed it out. So there's like selectively advantageous, and then there's slightly deleterious, so maybe it's not great, but it doesn't like completely destroy the function of the dingo, in which case it's probably still going to be able to reproduce in most cases, unless it's maybe a really harsh year or something. So could be, do they know if the tails are like that naturally, like from puppies, or are they like perhaps frostbite or something?
The trapper that I was working with is no longer with us, but he'd been trapping right up into his 70s, and he talked about, he thought it actually came in as part of when the Snowy scheme was running, and that's when he started to. I used to talk about stumpy tail dingoes occur in that area. They're not all stumpy tail, but there was a prevalence of it.
And I often get asked questions like, is that mean they're hybrids? And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe. Do we know that it's from a dog? Do we know that it could be from inbreeding or some other weird mutation that popped up as well? Could be. Don't know. We have to do genome testing.
And of course, the other around what the dingoes look like is that I know in the work that I was doing for many years, I talk to landholders and they say there's no dingoes, they're all Alsatian crosses. and of course, what we now know from the genetics and so on is that they're black and tan. And black and tan dingoes look very much like an Alsatian because of their coloration. And so that understanding still exists through many people in the community. There's no dingoes, they're just Alsatians. So there's a lot of misunderstanding within the community that I think we can all play a part in terms of raising everybody's knowledge so they can make informed decisions and informed understandings about this issue.
Right, you just hinted at the two characteristics that make dingo very distinct from a wild dog. One is they're breeding once a year rather than twice, and the other one was the social structure. Would you say that those are the two most important characteristics that distinguish one from the other, and would you say that those two things are what makes a dingo a more desirable predator in our ecosystems than a wild dog?
It's certainly more desirable because their capacity to breed is less than a domestic dog that's gone wild, so only breeding once per year, versus the potential to breed twice per year. The other is that in terms of where the work that has been done, where packs are formed, that you do get a tendency for the pack size to stay reasonably small, and where infanticide will occur from the dominant female actually killing pups of the subordinate females within the pack, so that she can, two things: one, reduce competition, but secondly, create a whole series of wet nurses within the other females within the pack. So the potential then is for population growth not to be as fast as it might be in a scenario with just domestic dogs that have gone wild. But of course the difficulty we have nowadays is that we do so much control, we're breaking down that pack structure. And so we might be undermining the ability of these dogs to self-regulate their numbers because we're constantly taking the alpha males and females through the baiting programs that we implement to protect our livestock operations. But they're the two. I think other speakers are going to talk today specifically about dingoes and what makes a dingo characteristically. Am I right, Amagi? So I don't want to take thunder from other people. People are going to talk about dingoes and why is this a dingo and why is that a dog and what's the difference. So.
Do you know about the work that Arian Wallach and Adam O'Neill and a few others did on Evelyn Downs over in South Australia?
No, I'm not familiar. How about you, Kylie?
Well,
Not bad, yeah. I do.
it ties in very closely with that second point about what we can do to control hybridisation of wild dingo populations, and essentially what they did was nothing. They had a pack of dingoes. It was a smallish pack. It was a big cattle station property that they went to. But there were lots of severely hybridised and just straight out feral dogs on the property and in the immediate vicinity as well. And Adam was actually went over there that was to control the wild dog problem. And when they got there, they decided to just do nothing. And after about 3 years, all the ferals had totally disappeared, and the hybridised ones that you could tell just by sort of looking at them reasonably hybridised, they declined quite a lot in their population as well, and it looked like it was actually because the dingoes weren't being persecuted and that stable pack structure was left stable, that they were then able to take back their territory, as it were, and keep all the others out. So that's a big answer to a lot of the problems that we do have, is to just leave it alone and let them sort it out.
There was a real life example of that for quite a number of years in Diamond Flat, which is an in-holding in the New England National Park down in the sticks. And the landholder there, he used to talk about there's a dingo pack that lives on the property. He chose not to bait them through this period. This was over a period of about 7 years. And he used to talk about the dingoes being present and lying in the sun in the paddock with calves, and there was no predation. The dingoes were focusing on native prey species, so certainly wallabies, kangaroos were in low densities because they were kept down. This was a pack of about 5 or so. I don't have the exact numbers in my head. And he said he used to talk about examples of where the cows would give birth and the calf would be on the ground, and the dingoes would come forward and they'd pull the afterbirth from the cow and then sit and consume the afterbirth with a young calf on the ground and ignore that and focus on the afterbirth and clearly like the placenta and so on.
And exactly the same situation.
Yeah, I've heard on the water ranges as well, similar story. Yeah.
So there are some good examples out there, and it is possible, but obviously with management and close monitoring of them, I think that's a very important part of it. And Kerry, you're going to talk about this, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, I'll talk a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
So
So
just at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about Ariane
Yeah?
how it's influenced us.
Oh, good. Okay, well, let's move off that topic so that we don't...
Oh, I don't do a lot on it, but
No?
happy to talk a lot about what they are.
So in your DNA studies, did you see a correlation at all between lethal control in certain areas where it was increased with the hybridisation going up, like with the disruption of the pack structures? Did you see, like in areas where the lethal control was more enforced, did we see a lot higher level of hybridisation? Or did you see any areas where you went back to and that scheme would change and you watched the difference happen in the...
In some ways, actually, the one place that comes to mind, it was actually the opposite, and that's looking at that Cathedral Rock area.
Yeah.
And because there is intensive sheep management in that area, very good quality, it's really good livestock country. And so the operators there for 100 years have been controlling dingoes, and that to protect their livestock operations. And I think that may actually be, to some degree, while there are still some good dingo left in that country, is because they were stopping the movement of hybrid genes coming in from populations elsewhere. So I think it can work both ways. I think you could actually use heavy control around identified populations to stop further movement of hybrid genes in. But clearly those areas would have to be large enough that the dingo population within it can maintain pack structures. And so there's a lot of good work going on that's looking at the home ranges that they require. And they are quite large. And so it is achievable, but it needs to be looked at really closely. And a lot of people need to come on board. And at the moment, the main focus is on, as you saw from the legislation, it's about control until livestock operations aren't impacted, and only then can you then consider conservation. That's where our legislation is at the moment.
Wondering about, talk about that research on the size of
The Department of Primary Industries are doing that work. So they're radio collaring using satellite collars and then looking at their movements.
how big are they?
Around 10 square kilometres for a dingo on the tablelands, and then on the coast it's smaller, maybe around 5 square kilometres.
Great. I believe there's quite an amount of data, genetic data and stuff that's been gathered by LLS and Parks and DPI and others that is not being made available to researchers to do extra studies on. Do you have a view on that?
No, look, I'm not sure that would be the case. So where you have people doing research, most researchers are very guarded of their research because they're looking to analyse it, publish it, and so you find that where people have a lot of samples and a lot of data, they're hanging on to that data because they want to be able to analyse it and then publish that information. And so you find then that it's not readily available to the general community until such time as they do publish. And so that slows down these discussions because there is a lot of knowledge that's out there, but until it gets published, and it's really important to keep that in mind, is that because a lot of people have opinions, and there's a lot of researchers who voice opinions about their work, but unless they publish where it gets peer reviewed, so that you know that not only do they believe what they're saying, but others who work in those fields have agreed that they're accurate interpretations, they're still only opinions. That's always my view. Even when you talk to a scientist, if they haven't published what they're talking about, then it's an opinion.
Yeah.
It's based on a lot of information, but it's still an opinion until it's published.
And peer reviewed.
And a lot of people working in this field, especially in terms of a lot of the home range work and so on, a lot of that hasn't been published as yet. I'm really excited. And eventually it does get out there and we can look at it in more detail.
Sometimes there's just a big lag time.
It just takes
Years.
time.
Like that project that Brad talked about, he's been working on it since 1992. Yeah?
96,
1996. And I think we kind of started analysing it in like 2012 was when he started analysing some of it. And we've only just now kind of sent it off for peer review in the last like 6 months to a year. So
Is that because of funding? Enough funding to do it?
Yeah, money's a big part of that. Yeah. And Kylie's up against that at the moment with the SNP genetics because it costs money. Just the laboratory time costs money.
Costs money to have
Yeah.
a job.
Yeah, and for some reason researchers like to eat. I
Yeah.
don't understand
I don't
it.
know why people would want to have a job.
So percentage-wise, the studies that are happening right now through DPI and the private ones through private researchers or whatever, what would be the correlation between conservation-based as opposed to like control-based in the studies?
Look, the majority of research is, if you're looking for funding, the easiest way to get funding is to say, look, I've got some ideas to look at how to more efficiently control wild dogs in the landscape. You're going to get funding. If you're saying, I want to find funding to look at how to conserve dingoes and wild dogs in the landscape,
So is there any studies at the moment, conservation-based?
Yes.
Well, yeah.
That's what you can't eat. I will be able to soon when I get my money. Yeah. There's just not much. Like science research in general is being squeezed by federal, state government sort of make decisions. So there's that squeeze, but there's also the squeeze in terms of like they have a small amount of money that they can give to things, so they have to choose the things that they think are the best. And they don't think that dingo conservation makes the cut. It doesn't make the cut. And yeah, so a lot of the research money that you do see, it's coming from organizations that have lots of money to spend on things on control or something because there's an agricultural incentive to have that money. Whereas there might not be as much agricultural incentive to say, let's conserve dingoes. That's not to say there's not research going on.
Yeah. So I've heard a rumour that Schedule 2 area is going to be no more, like soon enough. So what would be the ramifications of that if there was more areas of population that you spoke of that have those pure populations, and once those Schedule 2 areas are taken away and you can bake deeper into these areas, it doesn't have the greatest.
well, the consequences would be that those dingoes that remain with conservation value will disappear.
That's already happened. If you look at the LLS plans, have you had a look at them?
Yeah.
So the map for up here used to have the Schedule 2s on the mapping,
Yeah.
and it's not there anymore, and it refers to the previous Schedule 2 that
Yeah.
talks about conservation of dingoes, but they've dropped that
That's
Schedule 2.
why
That's why I was
yeah.
surprised when it was up before.
Yeah, they used to be called dingo management areas. That was dropped from the language. They're just simply listed as Schedule 2.
Well, that language has been dropped now. The
Yeah.
latest plan that came out in July.
So the main focus is to move to what's it was in one of the slides, what's called a biosecurity duty of care. And so as long as you fulfil your duty of care, then that's fine. But the difficulty is then how do you factor in conserving some of these remnant populations, and that's not very well addressed
So where's the
in
hope
any of
lie
that
if
planning.
it's getting progressively worse, the population is getting thin, and then what's like going to be some solutions to move forward? You know, it's just educating people, and then people turning around and saying to the government, no, we should be conserving the populations, or it's because we're not getting the funding for the studies as well, then it's hard to just show it on paper that what the role of dingo plays.
Like I think in the short term is for that view to be tabled when discussions are being made about where to do dingo control, and so they are in Wild Dog Association meetings, they are meetings of the local land services, and it's about members of the community voicing those opinions at those meetings so that they can be factored in, because if they're not tabled, then all of those discussions will be about how to more effectively remove this species from the landscape. And we're getting better and better at it. Yeah, the tools available are improving.
So on that topic, would you be willing to give your sort of mapping info about, where the significant populations are to sort of people like
Yeah, I'd be very interested.
these guys and other dingo campaigners so that they can make that approach, and it's not just we think they're there. This is documented research that shows that they are there. So
And this is where we need to get this paper published, so that once it's published, then it can be, because to table this at the moment, would be to say, well, where's
They'll
this
just say,
published?
well, it's not published.
Uh,
What is it?
Yeah, and so once it's published, then yes,
We're
definitely.
trying. It takes a long time. It takes a long time sometimes because it's not just that like sometimes it doesn't even get reviewed because they just decide, oh, it doesn't fit in this journal, so you just got to try again somewhere else. So it just takes time of months where they just make a decision and then they send it back to say, no, send it somewhere else, and then you send it somewhere else.
People like Ben Allen get to review different papers and stuff. Yes.
With the Ballinger turtle, there was a similar situation with research. It got presented at an international conference in China, and that way it got its way out into the world without, it was still up for peer review, but by being presented at an international conference, it sort of got a bit of, it could be published publicly, sort of.
Yeah.
With the acknowledgement at the end that it was.
Are you going overseas, Kylie, soon?
We might do some crowdfunding.
Don't have any dollars. Don't have any money for that.
Crowdfunding.
I don't know. So conferences cost a lot of money. Like, for example, even to present at like an Australian conference, it will probably cost $300 to $400 to get entry into the conference. So I mean, it's not a small amount of money. And then you're talking about accommodation and transfer and all that stuff. It can be, a lot of money. Yeah. But you still got a peer review to get to do a talk too. Like, they get to decide, the conference organisers get to decide which talks they're going to allow and so on. So, you know, peer review is the best way and it's on its way. You know, it's on its way.
Thank you very much, Brad. We'll have a half-hour break. And then Kerry Guppy, she'll be coming on and talking about the ecological role of dingoes and the Working Dingoes Saving Wildlife project. Okay, enjoy.